Germans. I mean, mind-boggling. And of course, those that bore the worst brunt of all this were the Jewish people, who were stubbornly other. They worshipped their own version of God. They didn't worship the Trinity and the Christ story. They worshipped their own, version of monotheism. And that really annoyed these Nazis, who therefore eventually just rounded them up as enemy aliens. Partly this was copied on the Armenian genocide by the Turks in World War I. Hitler got the idea that, well, they didn't come to the rescue of the Armenians, they're not going to bother about us killing the Jews. And, it's shocking that that was the case, but it was the case. And, this is an identity war. Okay, another example then is the Middle East, because now, and that emerged out of this chaos of World War I and II, we still have the unresolved problem of Israel and Palestine. Again, I'm going to say this is an identity war. We have the Lebanon under meltdown with endless sagas of identity conflict, and we have Iran and Israel and so on locked into another identity war. We have what's going on in Yemen, where you have Shias and Sunnis locked into an identity war. As founder of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, obviously this one really impacts me. I've travelled there. I think it's wrong. You see, I believe in identity peace. I've met amazing Palestinian intellectuals and people. I've met amazing Jewish and Israeli ones. To me, they're all brothers and sisters. They're part of the same family. It's the same project. And once we can get past this kind of either anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism or anti-Arabism or anti-Islamism, if we can get beyond all these antis, they're like the icebergs in the ocean as we're steaming towards, the port of peace. If we can actually study and analyse them and bring some light and heat to bear, then I think they will melt. I mean, I've looked into anti-Semitism endlessly. I studied under Professor Polonsky of the LSE at the very beginning of my, PhD process, and he has worked a lot with colleagues at Brandeis University and in Poland about, the historical roots of anti-Semitism, which I think is mainly to do with ignorance and jealousy. I think the hatred of the Jews, which is deep in European history, was to do with a misunderstanding of what Judaism is, a total misunderstanding of what that heritage is about. And instead of seeking understanding, it then reached a point of just hating. The way to deal with the other that you can't understand is just hate them. My strategy for dealing with the other you don't understand is to love them and understand them. And I believe that was what Christ was teaching as a great rabbinical, Kabbalistic, mystic, and if we were true to our genuine Christian heritage, we would have adopted that strategy. I mean, I'm a Philo-Semite in that I love all the Semitic peoples, starting with the Phoenicians, the Babylonians, the Arabs, the different Jewish, tribes and cultures, and the Hamito-Semitic people of the ancient Egyptians and the Ethiopians. I mean, this is a really rich heritage of cultures who are really fascinating. And I've studied the history of all the Semitic religions and languages and cultures. There's no grounds here for anti-Semitism. It's like being against rocks. I'm not anti-rocks. I mean, we live on rocks. They make the earth. You can't be anti-Semites because they are the people that have peopled the earth. What we can do is be critical of the legends and traditions and look again at all the God stories in the Bible and all the other scriptures from the Middle East. I mean, that's why I've spent years studying the Hamitic texts from ancient Egypt, or the Babylonian traditions of their pantheon, or the Sumerian deities. This is fascinating stuff. And my antidote to by either anti-Semitism or anti-Arabism or anti-Islamism and so on is a much more intensive study of their religious and spiritual and intellectual traditions. So if you look at my periodic table, the Jewish traditions are down the right-hand side, boxes 42, 60, 78 and 96. And they include fascinating things like the Samaritan traditions, the Karaite, Orthodox Judaism, Reformed Judaism, Conservatism, and the Kabbalah. And all these varieties then have sub-varieties, which, could keep professors busy for years studying and collating the texts and analysing and so on. Well, that's what the TRC for the Middle East is trying to do. But then we have all the Islamic boxes, the Gnostic, the Wahhabi, the Salafi, the Druze, philosophical Islam, Sufism, Ismaili, Shiism, and Sunnism. And again, they all have their own sub-varieties. And I've studied those for years. That's why I did my commentary on the Quran. And then you have all the Christian boxes, because Christ was from that region, that culture. He was of a Jewish origin, but I believe that he was let's say, a liberal Jewish thinker who was educated partly in Alexandria, and I've explained why I think that in other contexts. And he had that sort of merging of Hellenistic and mainstream Judaism that Philo had at the time. They saw the scriptures as largely allegorical helps to the advancement of cosmic consciousness, the Platonic nous, the Enlightenment potential that Plotinus was to write about. And Christ was, I think, educated in that way and was trying to communicate that to his disciples in Galilee, where he returned after his education. And if you read the Gospels in that light, it all makes sense. I believe he was absolutely certainly bilingual, Aramaic and Greek, and trilingual with Hebrew, and was a profound teacher. So all these blue boxes, all the varieties of Christianity that have come, emanate from that cosmopolitan outlook that Christ had, I think, and I've explained that in my commentaries on the 6 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Thomas and Mary Magdalene. There are 6 Gospels, and they all ought to be printed in the Christian Bibles, in my opinion, because they alone make sense. But, so the Middle East is an identity war conflict. It's conflicts within conflicts within conflicts that have been going on for centuries, generations. It's interesting that Christ's favourite game was an identity game. It was called Who Do You Say I Am? And he used to play this up in Panyas, which was sacred to the god Pan, showing something of Christ's humour, I think. Panopolis was a great city in Egypt dedicated to Pan. I believe Christ had travelled there. And so he felt really at home in Panyas, as it's called. And it was the source of the River Jordan. And he would gather with his disciples there. It was called Caesarea Philippi in his day. And he would play the Who Do You Say I Am game. And they'd go round the group of disciples, and Matthew said, "Well, you're a wise philosopher." Peter would say, "Well, you're the Messiah." And others would go and do their bit. And when it came to Thomas said, "Rabbi, my mouth cannot speak what I say you are. Cannot say it." And so Jesus said, as it were, "Well, okay, Thomas, you've got the right answer," and then he took him aside and said, "You've drunk from the same bubbling brook that I've drunk from." In other words, the stream of direct experience of the Godhead, of gnosis, as it came to be called in Greek. And that was the source of these Gnostic teachings, which I believe Christ was teaching. But we have to recover them. We can't just assume people understand this, because they don't. Each generation has to reacquire the intellectual paraphernalia to make accessing this level and depth of wisdom possible. Is it against conventional Christianity? Is this heresy? No, it's not, actually. It's the core of what authentic Christianity is supposed to be about, which is premised on this oral tradition that later was called the Kabbalah, and which was the source of Christ's own teachings. There's a tradition called Christian Kabbalah, which I firmly subscribe to, and that's what I'm talking about here. Now, all this, if it could be explained properly, if we could get a bunch of Druze and Jewish settlers and Zionists and Sufis and Sunnis and Lebanese and so on and so on from the Middle East all together, I believe that these identity wars can be solved once we see the aha moments in each of us when we realise that what we thought was our forever identity is actually just another cloud moving in the sky of history. And as that identity shifts and changes, it changes shape like clouds do. Why should we fight over whether your cloud looks like a bull or a goat? And therefore I'm going to bomb your villages, and you're going to attack mine because you think my cloud looks like, a devil or a demon or something. I mean, that's the level of, I think, fantasy politics that identity conflict's all about. To me, enlightenment is when the clouds move on and the pure blue sky is revealed, or the beautiful night sky, Nut, the goddess for the Egyptians, with the stars sparkling. That's enlightenment. And we can drop all these identity wars. Okay, and then finally I'm going to say, as I said, there's a few more here. There's Ukraine and Russia going at it. That's an identity war. The Russians under Putin have just swallowed the wrong pill. They've tried to rebrand themselves in some kind of nationalist nonsense, to be honest. Putin, as I've explained, is a sort of ex-KGB guy that he just wants to be big and powerful. He's the biggest thug on the world. And if you don't like him, he'll come and have you assassinated. This is just childish stuff. Yet he's managed to whip up such fear and hatred and antipathy, and by misusing state apparatus of television and so on, he's brainwashed the Russians into doing this, although hundreds of thousands apparently are leaving the country rather than fight a stupid war. Ukraine, meanwhile, is heroically trying to defend itself from these crazy compatriots. Well, actually, Ukrainians and Russians are very close in identity. It's almost as if the people of Yorkshire and the people of Sussex decided to have a huge war because they've got different dialects of English. I mean, the fundamental Slavic tongue that they both speak is very similar, as any linguist can point out. But it's become now a big identity thing that you say Kiev instead of Kiev or whatever. There are differences. Well, okay, they should be respected, but I think Russia is totally wrong in launching this war in such a foul way. And also now it's using these drones coming from Iran, which I think is pretty much proved, as if they're ethical. I mean, there's nothing ethical about this kind of warfare, and what they're doing to the poor Ukrainian people has to be stopped. And the only way it can be stopped is if people have that aha moment. If enough Russians around Putin and his circles have the aha moment. Look, hang on, what are we, Russians? Do we really want to go back to the days of Stalin and Ivan the Terrible? No. We had a kind of enlightenment. We had our Tolstoys, we had our Decembrists, we had our early socialist tradition, we had our intellectual tradition. And let's be faithful to that. We had our Bajayev and our Solovyev and so on. Let's find the best bits of Russian philosophy and live up to it. And just one observation on that, which is when I went to the Institute of Philosophy and spoke in those visionary halcyon days of the 1990s, I did a lot of study of Soviet Russian philosophy. It's just the very tail end of the Soviet system. And, these people had under Daffern, the Russian philosophical tradition had become Marxist. But they were intelligent Marxists. They were very clever people. Marxism is a very sophisticated and clever tradition. And they'd formulated the three fundamental laws of dialectic, which is what was taught in every Soviet university and school system. And one of the laws of dialectic was that things change into their opposites over time. This was an adaptation of Hegel's insight of how the dialectic operates in history, filtered through Marx and Engels. It was Engels that formulated these three laws. And one of them, a crucial one, is that things change into their opposite over time. Now, I think that my dear Russian friends ought to go back and study their 3 laws of dialectic, which their parents, youngsters in Russia now have probably never heard of them. Their parents had to study and learn and pass exams on them. I don't think Putin ever did any philosophy, obviously, because what he's done is he's turned the once great, liberal, outward-looking, cosmopolitan traditions of Russia into a sort of fascist project, anti-Semitic, everything that the great traditions of authentic Russian intellectual life stood opposed to, and why the actual Russian armies fought the Nazis in World War II. It's as if it's turned into the opposite. Putin and his Russian armies are now fighting people who fought the Nazis in Ukraine. And it's an example of this law of dialectic, that things change into their opposites. And it's a tragic example. And we should remember, therefore, the life, tragically, of Boris Romanchenko, who exemplifies this. He was Ukrainian, born in 1926. He was captured by the Nazis and taken to Buchenwald camp in Weimar, which was founded in 1937 by the SS, deliberately as a snub to Goethe and all he stood for. And he joined the opposition, the underground opposition movement inside the camp. They are very heroic people, these resistors. They plotted all kinds of bits of sabotage, and eventually, as the war came to an end, they actually seized control of the camp as the SS guards all fled. They were all skin and bones by then, but they had their dignity. The 4 agreements you had to sign up to, and Romanchenko did, was to be impeccable with your word, which is incredibly important in life, and very few people are nowadays. Don't take anything personally, which is important, in politics. Don't make assumptions, because, you never know, it might turn out to be fake what this person is saying. And always do your best. There were other things, like to fight for peace, for the destruction of fascism and the ending of the horrors of the war. Anyway, this wonderful man survived the war. Boris Romanchenko came back to Ukraine. He was still a young man. He did a degree. He qualified. He became a member of the Buchenwald Survivors Association. He used to give lectures throughout the Soviet Union. He was a hero of the Soviet Union and of Ukraine. And he survived and lived on till February 2022, living in Kharkiv, a wonderful city in the north of Ukraine. And tragically, he was sitting there in February as the first invasion was happening under these crazy Putinistas. And they targeted his apartment with a missile, and he was killed as it blew up. He'd survived the Nazis, and he'd become a great spokesperson for peace and international harmony and so on. And he's finally killed by Putin's rocket. To me, that sums up all that's utterly wrong and inverted about this war by Putin. Putin has turned into the opposite. He's turned into a Nazi, in fact. And all this ranting and ranting against Ukrainians is all just psychological projection, which is this inversion mechanism in operation. So these identity wars are costly. Poor old Romanchenko is a victim, along with thousands and thousands of other Ukrainians, and also the millions that have had to flee in terror out of the country. I read there's refugees now in Ireland. Ireland can't cope, can't put them anywhere, so it's building tents in parts of Dublin and in the outskirts, and they're freezing because these poor old Ukrainians are not used to Irish winters, which are very cold and very wet. You can't sleep at night when on the tent is coming this Irish rain and it's freezing, and the only loo is outdoors. And hundreds of Ukrainians are now living like this throughout Europe. I mean, this is all Putin's identity madness. The guy needs some serious therapy. I'm very happy to provide it, Vladimir. Get in touch. Ireland itself is an identity war over many generations, and there have been conflicts in Ireland since since the Book of Invasions, written down by the Druid historians of old. But most recently, the time of the British invasion, starting in the 12th century under Strongbow, and then the Normans, and complex layerings of Irish history. Then the Protestant Catholic divide and the conflicts involving Ulster in the south, and this was going on up until the Good Friday Agreement, which put an end to it all. I lived through the bombings in London by the IRA and in Manchester and elsewhere. We don't want to go back to all that, but that's what Brexit has done. And if we don't reverse it, it will return to the streets of Ireland, this conflict. But no, I always say, when people ask me what am I, when I say I'm a Catholic Protestant, I'm both. As an Anglican Quaker, Sufi, Druid, with Buddhist initiations and so on, I'm definitely a Catholic Protestant. In other words, these identity wars just bounce off me. They're not endemic to my identity. My identity's bigger than that. And I believe that's the solution to these problems. Another example of an identity conflict is Armenia and Azerbaijan and the battles over Artsakh. And I've been very upset at all this stuff going on with my friend Gevorg Manoukian in Armenia, telling me the horrors of what's happening. The Azerbaijanis invading again. It's as if they want to eradicate the Armenian presence in these uplands of Artsakh. And instead of treasuring and valuing their cultural uniqueness, they want to eradicate it. Is that because to certain kinds of Muslims, Christianity itself is an identity threat? Having churches dedicated to the Trinity is a sort of existential threat to a Muslim that doesn't believe in plurality of views and tolerance. Sadly, there is a rhetorical extremist streak within pseudo-Islam, I don't call it genuine Islam, which is against Trinitarianism and sees it as a threat. And it doesn't realise that, on balance, the Quran is much more in favour of the toleration between religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam particularly. Although Muhammad didn't understand or believe in the Trinity, he never had instruction in it. He nevertheless respected the Christians he'd met, like in Ethiopia, and the cultures that he hadn't been to Ethiopia himself, but he knew a lot about it. And he married a couple of these Christians. He respected their right to their beliefs. And so the model of extreme anti-Trinitarian violence, which the Azerbaijanis have been doing by bombing churches and so on, is not endorsed within the Quran, as I've explained in my commentary. Nor is it in Nigeria, where extremist Muslim groups are again going around kidnapping, killing Christians just for being Christian, because they have a Trinitarian view of existence. Those are identity crises where one team, as it were, associates with the Quran, with Muhammad, with Islam, with those set of beliefs and identities, and the other team identifies with Christ and the Church and the Trinity and the Father, Son and Holy Spirit, and the dynamic interplay between those three persons within one Godhead. I think it's time for a more sophisticated conversation on this planet between these traditions, and that's why I've called, on behalf of the World Intellectual Forum, the World Wisdom Forum as we call it, for peace dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Artsakh. And we've issued declarations to that effect, which you're welcome to sign. And another example of identity war is, of course, European colonizations of the Americas. and the native Indian resistance to that, and their largely forlorn struggle. I just had a visit by a Chilean, and it's interesting researching the history of Chile. The Indians in the southern part of Latin America, in Chile, resisted pretty much the longest, and were not finally brought to a treaty of peace until the 1870s. And many of the conquistadors who founded Santiago and the other great cities, Concepcion of Chile, actually were killed by these Indians who were quite fierce. And that's just one example. I mean, think of the Great Sioux Wars and all the battles that went on in North America. I mean, this is an identity conflict, a cultural conflict between the sort of Christianizing forces, be they Protestant or Catholic, and the native primal religious views which said these people are a threat, we must fight them. And they had their own profound spiritual teachings, which actually were about peace ultimately. And I'm a great fan of Deganawida, the peace teacher of North American Indian culture from Canada and the Great Lakes region and upper New York State. So I believe that it's possible to reconcile these cultural wars, the Indian and Christian conflict culturally. I think, how big is your concept of Great Spirit? Mine is big enough to encompass the God of Christianity, the God of Islam, the God of Judaism, the gods of Hinduism, the gods of all religions, from the periodic table. Even the God of Marxism with his 3 laws of dialectic. My understanding of Great Spirit, which is similar to Deganawida, is that, yes, that God is big enough to rally all these tribes as one great family of nations and family of faiths, and that your differential from mine doesn't cause a threat to me. It's actually a source of rejoicing. If I called a potlatch a great feast in the Longhouse, as Deganawida did, and invited everyone to bring their favourite dish from all the tribes of the Americas, North America, and some bring corn dishes, some bring squash dishes, some bring exotic things from Peru based on tomatoes or whatever, and some bring, different sweetmeats and so on. I wouldn't say, oh God, it's a threat, they've got different foods to us, kill them. No, it's a feast we're having here. So the same with these spiritual teachings and traditions. Islam is incredibly interesting and complex and rich, and the more you study it, the more you realise it's infinite in its profundity. But so is Christianity, and so is Judaism. The more and more you study the Kabbalah, the more profound and rich you realise these teachings are. And many of the greatest Kabbalists came from Ukraine, actually, which is another reason it's so tragic. Or they came from Spain, like Isaac Luria. And he said, rightly, that our duty is to go round all the traditions and gather up the sparks of light that have come from the sort of shattering of the vessels that he talked about. Humanity is one thing, but we've made of it, a Babel. It's actually one thing, and we have to get back to that unity, which he called tikkun, which we can only do through prayer and through devotion to the absolute and to the particular, which is where science comes in. Right, I'm going to have a pause there. I'm going to stop the first half of this talk, and then afterwards I'm going to go on to the second part, which is, well, what is the solution to all this? I've run through the problems. These are examples of identity wars, conflicts that have been going on. Some of them still are. Well, what's the good news? I'll come back and share that very shortly.